3 weeks ago, a padded envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address. My name written in blue ink, neat cursive, a woman's handwriting. The postmark was smudged, partially illegible, but I could make out part of a state abbreviation. It started with an I, Illinois maybe, or Indiana, or Iowa. Inside, wrapped in a single sheet of blank notebook paper, was a cassette tape. The tape was old, you could tell by the shell. That particular shade of off-white that plastic turns after decades of oxidation. The brand name on the front said Aurex in faded silver lettering. I'd never heard of it. Later, I'd learn it was a Toshiba subsidiary, a budget line sold mostly in Japan during the late 70s. Finding one in America was unusual. Finding one addressed to me was something else entirely. The label was faded, handwritten. It said, "For you, play when alone." I should have thrown it away. I didn't. See, I collect cassette tapes. Have for years. Started in college when I found a box of my dad's old mixtapes in the garage. Stuff he'd recorded off the radio in the 70s. Casey Kasem countdowns. Songs he'd pause and unpause to skip the commercials. You could hear him breathing sometimes, waiting for the next track to start. There's something intimate about that. About hearing someone's presence in a recording they never meant for anyone else to hear. Over the years, I've accumulated hundreds of tapes, thrift stores, estate sales, online auctions, from people clearing out dead relatives' belongings. I've found recordings that would make your skin crawl, therapy sessions someone forgot to erase, a woman singing lullabies to a baby who's probably in their 40s now, a tape of someone crying for 45 minutes straight with no context, no explanation, just grief, captured in iron oxide. Once I found a tape labeled Birthday Party 1986 that contained nothing but static, and buried underneath it what sounded like whispered counting. 1 through 100, over and over in a voice that didn't sound quite human. When you collect enough of these things, you stop being surprised. You start being curious. You start to understand that magnetic tape is strange. It captures more than sound. It captures moments, emotions, sometimes things that shouldn't be captured at all. So, when a cassette showed up in my mailbox, unexplained, anonymous, I wasn't scared. I was interested. So I took the tape to my office, slid it into my deck, and pressed play. What I heard was a woman's voice. Calm, measured, like she was reading a statement she'd rehearsed many times. She said her name was Margaret Hollis. She said she was recording this because she needed someone to know what happened. She said she'd found my address in an old forum post about strange recordings, and she hoped I was the kind of person who would listen. Then she told me about the house on Vickery Lane. This is her story. I'm going to tell it exactly as she told it to me. Margaret Hollis was 53 years old when she inherited her aunt's house. Her Aunt Catherine had lived alone in that house for over 40 years, ever since her husband passed in 1979. Catherine was the kind of woman who kept to herself. No children, few friends. A quiet life in a quiet town about 2 hours north of Chicago. When she died in her sleep at 87, Margaret was her only living relative. Margaret hadn't been close to Catherine. Not really. There had been a few visits in childhood. Summer weeks spent running through the big Victorian house, playing in the backyard, listening to Catherine hum strange melodies while she cooked. But as Margaret grew older, the visits stopped. Catherine became a name on a Christmas card, a voice on the phone once or twice a year, a distant relative growing more distant with each passing decade. When the lawyer called to say Catherine had passed, Margaret felt something she couldn't quite name. Not grief, exactly. Something more like guilt. All those years she could have visited, could have called, could have done something to break her aunt's isolation. And now it was too late. The house wasn't worth much. A 2-story Victorian that had seen better days, sitting on a half-acre lot at the end of a dead-end street. The neighborhood had declined over the decades. Most of the other houses were rentals now, occupied by people who came and went without putting down roots. Catherine's house was one of the last owner-occupied properties on the block. Margaret didn't want to keep it. She lived in Minneapolis, had a career, a husband, a life. The plan was to clean out Catherine's belongings, sell the house as is, and be done with it. She figured it would take a week, maybe 2. She was wrong. Margaret arrived on a Friday afternoon in early October. The leaves were turning and the street had that particular autumn stillness, the kind where sounds carry too far and shadows stretch too long. She parked in the driveway, her rental car looking impossibly modern against the backdrop of the old Victorian house, and sat there for a moment, just looking. The house looked tired. Paint peeling from the wooden siding, shutters hanging at odd angles, the porch sagging in the middle like a weary spine. But there was something else too, something she couldn't quite articulate. The house looked watchful, alert, as if it had been waiting for her. She shook off the thought and retrieved the key from the lockbox the estate attorney had arranged. The moment she stepped onto the porch, she heard something. A creak from inside the house, the kind of sound a floorboard makes when someone steps off it quickly. She froze, key in hand, straining to hear more. Nothing. Just the wind in the dead leaves. Just her imagination. She unlocked the door and let herself in. The smell hit her first. Not rot, not decay, something older. Dust and mothballs and decades of closed windows and something else underneath it all, something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in a vase. The kind of smell that accumulates in houses where nothing has changed for a very long time. The kind of smell that makes you think of preservation, of things kept past their expiration. The interior was exactly as she remembered from childhood visits. Floral wallpaper in the hallway, dark wood trim, a staircase with a carved banister that had fascinated her as a girl. Catherine had been old-fashioned even then, keeping the house frozen in a kind of perpetual 1970s amber. Now, 30 years later, it looked less quaint and more like a time capsule. Margaret spent the first day just walking through rooms, taking inventory. Catherine had been a collector. Not a hoarder exactly, but close. Every surface held something. Porcelain figurines, antique clocks, stacks of National Geographic magazines going back to the 1960s. The basement was full of furniture. The attic was full of boxes. It was going to take longer than a week. She called her husband that night, sitting on Catherine's old sofa, surrounded by someone else's lifetime of accumulated objects. "It's a lot," she told him. "I'm going to need at least a month." He understood. He always understood. That was the thing about David, 26 years of marriage. And he still gave her space when she needed it. Margaret settled into a routine. Wake up early, work until dark, fall asleep exhausted. She started in the attic, figuring she'd work her way down. Most of what she found was unremarkable. Old clothes, holiday decorations, boxes of paperwork that needed to be shredded. Catherine had saved everything. Receipts from 1984, warranty cards for appliances that no longer existed, birthday cards from people Margaret had never heard of. It was in the second week that she found the room. There was a door at the end of the upstairs hallway that Margaret had assumed was a closet. It was locked, and none of the keys on Catherine's ring seemed to fit. The door itself was unremarkable. Same dark wood as the rest of the trim, same tarnished brass doorknob. But something about it bothered her, something she couldn't put her finger on. She realized what it was on the fourth day: the dust. Every surface in this house was coated in a fine layer of dust. On the furniture, on the picture frames, on the windowsills. But the floor in front of this door was clean, not spotless, but noticeably less dusty than everywhere else, as if someone had been walking here. Recently, repeatedly. She'd made a mental note to deal with it later and moved on, but the door kept nagging at her. She found herself pausing every time she passed it, studying the handle, or running her fingers along the frame. Once she pressed her ear against the wood and listened. She heard nothing, but she could have sworn the air coming from under the door was colder than the rest of the hallway. On the 9th day, while sorting through a box of old tools in the basement, she found a key that didn't match anything else. Small brass, old-fashioned. The kind of key you'd see in an antique store. The kind that belonged to a different era entirely. It was hidden at the bottom of the box, wrapped in a piece of cloth that might once have been white, but had yellowed with age. On a whim, she took it upstairs and tried it in the locked door. It fit. The lock turned with a sound like a sigh, or maybe that was her imagination. The door swung open slowly, as if the hinges were reluctant to move after years of disuse. Beyond it was a room Margaret had never seen before. Not a closet, a full bedroom, maybe 12 feet by 12 feet, with a single window that looked out onto the backyard. The curtains were drawn, heavy velvet the color of dried blood, and the light that filtered through was the color of old bones. Dust motes hung suspended in the air, swirling slowly in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The room was empty except for a single piece of furniture, a wooden chair positioned in the exact center of the floor, facing the window. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long time, trying to understand what she was looking at. The rest of the house was cluttered to the point of claustrophobia. Every room overflowed with Catherine's possessions. But this room was bare. Deliberately bare, as if someone had removed everything that had once been here and left only the chair. She stepped inside. The floorboards creaked under her weight, loud in the silence. The air was different in here, colder somehow, and stale in a way that suggested the door hadn't been opened in years. The chair was old. Oak, she thought, with a straight back and no cushion. The kind of chair you'd find in a farmhouse kitchen 100 years ago. It faced the window at a precise angle, positioned so that someone sitting in it would have a clear view of the backyard. And beyond that, the woods that bordered the property. Margaret walked around the chair slowly, examining it. There were marks on the arms, grooves worn into the wood, as if someone had gripped it tightly, repeatedly, over a long period of time. The front legs had shallow depressions in the floor beneath them, suggesting the chair had sat in this exact spot for decades. She looked at the window. The curtains were heavy velvet, faded to a murky gray-green. She reached out to pull them aside. The view was unremarkable. An overgrown backyard, A rusted swing set she remembered from childhood, and beyond that, a line of trees marking the edge of Catherine's property. The woods weren't deep, maybe 100 yards of scrubby forest before you hit the next street over. Nothing special. Nothing that warranted a chair positioned for decades of watching. Margaret let the curtain fall back into place. She turned to leave. That's when she noticed the marks on the wall. They were behind the door, hidden when it was open. Tally marks scratched into the wallpaper with something sharp. Hundreds of them, grouped in sets of 5, covering a section of wall about 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Margaret counted. She stopped at 500 and realized she wasn't even halfway done. She left the room. She locked the door behind her. She didn't go back in for 3 days. Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the room. She tried to focus on the work. There was still so much to sort through, so much to dispose of. But her mind kept returning to that empty space, that solitary chair, those hundreds of tally marks scratched into the wall. What had Catherine been counting? She called the estate attorney, a man named Richards, who had handled Catherine's affairs for years. She asked him about the room. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said. "Miss Hollis never mentioned a locked room to me." "Did she ever talk about watching something from the house?" A long pause. Miss Hollis was a private woman. She didn't share much about her personal life. "Is there a problem with the property?" Margaret said no. There was no problem. She thanked him and hung up. That night she couldn't sleep. She lay in Catherine's bed. She'd been sleeping in the master bedroom, trying to acclimate to the house, and stared at the ceiling. The house made sounds around her. Old houses always do. Settling, creaking, the mysterious pops and groans of aged wood. But tonight, the sounds seemed different, more deliberate, as if the house was trying to tell her something. Around 2 a.m, she heard footsteps. They came from above, from the attic. Slow, measured steps crossing from one side to the other. The ceiling creaked with each one, and Margaret could track the movement. Left to right, pause, right to left, pause, like something pacing, like something waiting. Margaret held her breath. She told herself it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, that had found its way in through a gap in the eaves. Squirrels, rats, anything but what it sounded like. But the steps were too regular, too heavy, too deliberate. They had a rhythm to them, a cadence that felt almost ceremonial. Step, 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 pause, step, 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 pause. Then the rhythm changed. The footsteps stopped pacing and moved toward the attic stairs. Margaret heard the first step creak, the one at the very top, the one she knew from her own trips up and down. Then the second step, then the third. Something was coming down. She pulled the covers up to her chin like a child, feeling ridiculous and terrified at the same time. The steps continued, slow and steady. She could picture it, whatever it was, descending in the darkness, one hand on the banister, taking its time. The attic stairs ended in the hallway. Margaret heard the footsteps reach the bottom, heard them turn toward her room, heard them approach, step by creaking step, until they stopped directly outside her door. She stared at the door, at the thin crack of darkness at the bottom where the light from the hallway should have been but wasn't. Something was blocking it. Something was standing right there, inches away, separated from her by nothing but a piece of old wood. Margaret didn't move. She didn't breathe. She watched the door, waiting for the handle to turn, waiting for the hinges to creak, waiting for... Nothing happened. For 5 minutes she lay there. For 10. For what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. And then slowly she heard the footsteps retreat. Back down the hallway, back up the stairs, back into the attic. The pacing resumed. Left to right, right to left, and continued until dawn. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. She didn't even close her eyes. In the morning, Margaret searched the attic. She searched every room. She found nothing out of place. No sign of an intruder, no animal droppings or tracks. The house was exactly as she'd left it. She almost convinced herself she'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. But that night it happened again. Footsteps in the attic, descending to her door, stopping, waiting, retreating. The same pattern, the same rhythm, as if something was testing her, seeing how she would react. The third night, Margaret didn't stay in the bedroom. She sat in the living room with every light on, a kitchen knife in her lap, waiting. The footsteps came at the same time, just after 2 a.m., but this time they didn't descend all the way. They stopped at the top of the stairs, as if whatever was up there knew she was watching. She heard something else that night, a sound she hadn't noticed before underneath the footsteps, humming. A tune she didn't recognize, melodic and strange, rising and falling in patterns that didn't quite resolve. It was coming from the attic, from whatever was up there, walking back and forth in the dark. Margaret made a decision. She was going to find out what was in that attic. She waited until daylight. She armed herself with a flashlight, a hammer, and her phone with 911 ready to dial. She climbed the narrow stairs, pushed open the hatch, and pulled herself up into the crawl space above. The attic was empty. Not empty like the locked room, empty like it had been cleared. All the boxes she'd been sorting through were gone. The furniture was gone. The old dress forms, the broken lamps, the Christmas decorations in their moldy cardboard containers, all of it vanished. The attic was nothing but bare wooden beams and dust. Margaret stood there, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, trying to understand. She had been up here yesterday. She'd spent hours going through Catherine's things. Now there was nothing. She was still standing there, frozen in confusion, when she saw the hatch at the far end of the attic. It was small, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, set into the floor near the eaves. She had never noticed it before. But then again, the attic had been so cluttered that she couldn't have reached this corner if she'd tried. The hatch had a lock on it, an old brass lock corroded with age. Margaret knew with sudden certainty that the key in her pocket would fit. She didn't open it. Not then. She climbed back down, her hands shaking, and called her husband. She told him everything: the locked room, the chair, the tally marks, the footsteps, the vanished boxes, the hidden hatch. David listened. When she was done, he asked one question. "Do you want me to come down there?" Margaret thought about it. She thought about leaving, getting in her car, driving back to Minneapolis and never seeing this house again. She could hire someone to clean it out. She could sell it without ever stepping inside again. But she didn't say yes. She said, "Not yet. I need to understand what's happening first." David didn't argue. He never argued. He told her to be careful, to call him if anything changed, to trust her instincts. She promised she would. That night, Margaret sat in the locked room, in the chair facing the window. She didn't know why. It felt right somehow, like the house wanted her there, like she was finally doing what Catherine had done for all those years. She opened the curtains and looked out at the backyard. The swing set was still there, skeletal in the moonlight. The trees beyond it were black shapes against a blacker sky. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Margaret waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for. At 2:17 a.m., she saw it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the moonlight, a shadow that moved wrong, a branch swaying in a breeze she couldn't feel. But then it separated from the tree line, and she knew. A figure emerged from the woods. Pale, impossibly pale, like milk, like bone, like something that had never seen sunlight. It moved with a strange, shuffling gait, its limbs bending at angles that weren't quite right, as if it had learned to walk by watching humans but hadn't quite gotten the mechanics down. It crossed the yard slowly, deliberately, approaching the house with the patient certainty of something that had all the time in the world. Margaret watched it pass the property line, the invisible boundary that separated the woods from Catherine's land. She watched it shuffle past the rusted swing set, past the overgrown garden beds, past the spot where she'd found a deflated basketball on her first day. It was getting closer. Margaret couldn't move, couldn't look away. Her hands were clenched on the arms of the chair so tightly that her knuckles had gone white, and she could feel the wood biting into her palms. But she couldn't release her grip, couldn't do anything but watch. The figure stopped at the swing set. It was maybe 50 feet from the house now, close enough that she should have been able to see its face, to make out features, to understand what she was looking at. But the moonlight seemed to slide off it somehow, refusing to illuminate, refusing to reveal. All she could see was the shape, vaguely human, vaguely wrong, and the pale, pale color of something that didn't belong in this world. It turned toward the window, toward her. She felt its attention like a physical weight, pressing against her chest, making it hard to breathe. It knew she was there. It knew she was watching, and it was studying her in return, taking her measure, deciding something. They stayed like that for hours. Margaret in the chair, the figure in the yard, neither moving, neither looking away. She could feel her legs going numb, her back screaming from the rigid posture, her eyes burning from the effort of not blinking. But she didn't move. Some instinct older than thought told her that if she moved, if she looked away, if she broke the connection, something terrible would happen. The sky began to lighten. The stars faded. The first gray light of dawn crept over the horizon, and as it did, the figure turned away. It walked back across the yard with that same shuffling gait, back past the swing set, back past the property line, back into the trees. Margaret watched until it disappeared into the shadows. Then she looked down at her hands. She had gripped the arms of the chair so tightly that her fingers were numb. Her nails had dug into the wood, leaving fresh marks alongside the grooves Catherine had worn over decades. Crescent-shaped gouges, evidence of a night spent in wordless terror. She understood now. She understood what her aunt had been doing in this room for 40 years, keeping watch every night, alone in the dark, staring down something that should not exist, and somehow, impossibly, keeping it at bay. Margaret found Catherine's journal hidden in the basement, behind a false panel in the wall. The panel was covered by a shelf of old paint cans, and she only discovered it by accident. She'd knocked one of the cans over, and when she bent to pick it up, she noticed the seam. A hairline crack in the wall that didn't match the rest of the foundation. She pried it open with a screwdriver. Behind it was a small alcove, barely big enough to hold what was inside. A metal lockbox, rusted at the corners, secured with a combination lock. The combination was Catherine's birthday. Margaret tried it on a hunch, and the lock clicked open. Inside was a composition notebook, the kind you'd buy at any drugstore. Black and white marbled cover, wide-ruled pages. It was filled with Catherine's cramped handwriting, the letters small and tight, as if she was trying to fit as much as possible into each page. As if she was afraid of running out of room. The entries spanned decades. 40 years of observations, experiences, theories, and fear. Margaret read them all in a single sitting, barely breathing, her eyes burning from the strain. The first entry was dated November 3rd, 1979, 3 days after Harold's death. "I know what I saw," Catherine had written. "I know it wasn't natural. Harold didn't have a heart attack. Something scared him to death. Something from the woods. I saw its face. I saw what it did to him. And now it knows that I saw." The next few entries described what Margaret had already experienced. The footsteps, the watching, the sense of something circling the property like a wolf around a campfire. Catherine had called the police, the church, anyone who would listen. No one believed her. No one could see what she saw, but Catherine could see it. Every night it emerged from the trees. Every night it watched the house. And every night it came a little closer. December 12th, 1979, one entry read, "I fell asleep in the living room. When I woke up, it was standing in the backyard. Not at the tree line, in the yard. Maybe 30 feet from the house. I could see it clearly for the first time. I wish I hadn't. I wish I didn't know what it looks like. I will never describe it here. Some things should not be put into words." Catherine discovered the rules through trial and error. She learned that the thing in the woods would not approach while she was watching. As long as her eyes were on it, as long as she maintained that connection of attention and awareness, it stayed where it was. But if she looked away, even for a moment, it moved, it advanced, and it never retreated on its own. She tried to leave, multiple times in those first few months. Her car would break down on the highway. She'd get lost on roads she'd driven 100 times. Once, she made it all the way to her sister's house in Indiana, only to find the thing waiting for her in the backyard when she arrived. She drove home that night. She never tried to leave again. February 2nd, 1980, I understand now. It's attached to me, not to the house. To me. Wherever I go, it follows. The only way to protect anyone else is to stay here, to keep it contained, to keep watching. The journal documented her nightly vigils, year after year, decade after decade. She recorded the thing's movements, its patterns, its behavior. She theorized about what it might be, a demon, a ghost, something older and stranger that had no name in any language. She never reached a conclusion. What she did reach was a kind of peace. Not happiness, never that, but acceptance, an understanding that this was her life now. This was her purpose. "I am the watcher," she wrote in an entry from 1995. "As long as I watch, it waits. As long as I wait, others are safe. This is not the life I wanted, but it is the life I have, and I will live it until I can't anymore." The last entry in the journal was dated 3 days before her death. "I'm so tired," she had written. "I haven't slept more than an hour at a time in 40 years. I don't think I can do this much longer. My body is failing. My eyes aren't what they used to be. Sometimes I see 2 figures in the yard instead of 1, and I don't know which is real. I'm sorry for whoever comes next. I'm sorry I couldn't stop it. I'm sorry I couldn't do anything but watch. But someone has to. Someone always has to. It's hungry, it's patient, and it never forgets. Margaret closed the journal. She sat in the basement surrounded by her aunt's secrets and cried for a woman she'd never really known. A woman who had sacrificed everything. Her husband, her freedom, her sanity, her life, to hold the line against something no one else could see. And now that line had been passed to her. She could have left. She knows that now. She could have walked away, sold the house, let whoever bought it discover the truth for themselves. It would have been someone else's problem, someone else's nightmare. She thought about it. God, how she thought about it. She sat in that chair for hours, arguing with herself, listing all the reasons why this wasn't her responsibility. Catherine had chosen to stay. Margaret hadn't. Catherine had seen Harold die. Margaret had only heard a story. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe Catherine had been mentally ill, had spent 40 years battling delusions that had no basis in reality. But she'd seen the figure. She'd felt its attention. She'd watched it wait. She thought about David, about their life in Minneapolis, about the future they'd planned. Retirement in 5 years, travel, grandchildren if their daughter ever settled down. She thought about everything she'd be giving up if she stayed. And then she thought about what Catherine had done. 40 years of solitary vigil. 40 years of holding the line alone without help, without hope of escape. Her aunt had sacrificed everything. Her marriage to a dead man, her relationships with distant family, her chance at any kind of normal life, to keep that thing contained, to protect strangers who would never know what she'd done for them. Margaret thought about the town, about the families living in the houses down the street, about the children who played in the yards she could see from Catherine's porch, about what would happen if the thing in the woods was no longer held at bay, if it was free to move, to hunt, to do whatever it had been waiting 40 years to do. She couldn't let it out. She couldn't let Catherine's sacrifice mean nothing. She called David that night. She told him she wasn't coming home. He didn't understand. How could he? She couldn't explain it in a way that made sense. She couldn't tell him about the figure, the journal, the room with its single chair. She just said she had to stay, that something was holding her here, that she was sorry. He drove down the next weekend. She met him on the porch and wouldn't let him inside. They talked for hours, argued, really the first real fight of their marriage. And in the end, he left without her. She watched his car disappear down Vickery Lane, and she felt something inside her close like a door. That was 6 months ago. Margaret has been in this house ever since. Every night she sits in the chair, every night she watches. The thing is still there, still waiting at the tree line, still patient beyond human comprehension. It never changes. It never moves closer as long as she's watching. But she can feel it. She can feel its hunger, its endless, ancient hunger. It wants inside. It wants her. It wants whatever comes after her. And someday, it will get what it wants. She's made this recording because she's getting older. Because she can't do this forever. Because someday, someone will have to take her place. Whether they want to or not. The thing in the woods doesn't choose randomly. Catherine's journal made that clear. It selects, it finds people who are alone, who are forgotten, who won't be missed when they disappear into a house at the end of a dead-end street. It finds people like Catherine, like Margaret, like you. If you're listening to this, you need to understand something. The house is already yours. Margaret has made arrangements with the same law firm that handled Catherine's estate. When she dies, when she finally falls asleep and doesn't wake up, or when her heart gives out from decades of sleepless nights, or when she simply can't watch anymore, the house will pass to you. She found your address the same way Catherine found hers. There's a pattern to it, a logic she doesn't understand. The house knows who comes next. It always knows. You'll receive the deed in the mail. You'll feel drawn here the way Margaret was, the way Catherine was before her. You'll tell yourself you're just going to look, just going to check it out, just going to see what you've inherited. And then you'll see the room, and the chair, and the thing in the woods, and you'll understand. Margaret is sorry. She's so sorry. She wishes there was another way. She searched for one, spent months looking through Catherine's journal, researching the occult, trying to find anything that might break the chain. There's nothing. The thing cannot be killed. It cannot be banished. It can only be watched. Someone has to watch. It's always been this way. It will always be this way. And now, whether you want it or not, it's your turn. The tape ended there. Static hissing. Then silence, then the click of the deck auto-stopping. I sat in the dark for a long time after that. An hour, maybe more. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I just sat there listening to the silence of my own house, trying to convince myself that what I'd heard was fiction, a story, someone's creative writing project, sent to me as a joke. But I couldn't stop thinking about the details, the address, the name, the way the story matched things I'd written about years ago, in forums I'd forgotten I'd ever posted in. Around 3 a.m, I went to my mailbox. There was a letter inside. A legal envelope, heavy cream paper, a law firm's return address in a town I'd never heard of in Illinois. The envelope was thick, official. I didn't open it. Not that night. I just held it in my hands and felt the weight of it, felt the paper, smooth and cold against my fingers. I knew what it said. I knew without looking. I'm recording this now because I need someone else to know. I need a record of what's happening in case I don't make it, in case I fall asleep, in case the thing at the end of Vickery Lane finally gets what it's been waiting for. The deed arrived 3 days ago. I told myself I wasn't going to go. I told myself it was a scam, a hoax, someone's idea of a sick joke. I threw the envelope in the trash. I fished it out an hour later. I threw it away again. I fished it out again. I can feel it now. That pull Margaret described. That certainty that I need to see it for myself. It's like a hook in my chest, tugging me north, tugging me toward a house I've never seen in a town I've never visited. I'm not going to fight it anymore. I leave tomorrow. I've already packed a bag. I've already told my family I'll be gone for a while, cleaning out a property I inherited from a distant relative. They didn't ask questions. They never do. I don't know what I'll find when I get there. Maybe nothing. Maybe the house will be empty, Margaret long gone, the whole thing a delusion I can finally put behind me. But I don't think so. I think the chair will be there, waiting for me. I think the window will look out onto woods that go dark too early. I think when night falls, I'll see something emerge from the trees. And I think I'll sit down. Because someone has to watch. If you're hearing this tape, if someone sent it to you the way it was sent to me, the way it's been sent down through the years, one watcher to the next, then I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what's coming. I'm sorry for the choice you're about to make. But you already know what you're going to do, don't you? You're going to go. you're going to see. You're going to sit in that chair and look out that window and become part of a chain that stretches back further than any of us can imagine. Because the thing in the woods is patient and hungry, and it never ever forgets. Someone has to watch, and now I think it's going to be you.